Imagine walking into an exclusive first-class lounge, only to be told, you don't belong here. But what if the man denying you entry had no idea you were the one in charge? This isn't just about one moment of disrespect. It's about power, justice, and taking down a system built to silence the wrong people. Stay with us, because this story, it's not just revenge, it's a reckoning. The early morning light filtered through the tinted windows of the sleek black limousine as it pulled into the private executive entrance of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The rhythmic hum of tires against the pavement faded as the car slowed, merging into the organized chaos of one of the busiest airports in the country. Inside the limousine, Lorraine Carter sat in silence, her gaze fixed beyond the glass. She watched the sea of airport employees, baggage handlers, flight attendants, security personnel, all moving in synchronized urgency. Each of them had a role, a duty to uphold the flow of this massive system. Yet Lorraine knew, beneath the surface of this efficiency, there were cracks, and she was here to fix them. She tapped her fingers lightly on the leather seat, her mind running through the challenges ahead. Being appointed as the new CEO of this airport was an achievement, but it was also an invitation for scrutiny. The first Black woman to hold this position, some called it progress, others called it disruption. Lorraine knew exactly what it was, a battle. She had spent years climbing the ranks in the aviation industry, enduring comments disguised as advice, skepticism masked as concern. She had sat in boardrooms where men twice her age questioned her qualifications, while simultaneously benefiting from her strategic decisions. She had learned early on that the world didn't just hand respect to people like her. She had to demand it. The limousine came to a stop at a secluded drop-off point reserved for airport executives. Lorraine glanced at the driver, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, who turned to her with a polite nod. "Miss Carter, would you like me to wait here for you?" She shook her head, reaching for her leather handbag. "No, I won't need a ride back. Thank you." With that, she stepped out, inhaling the crisp morning air. The scent of jet fuel and coffee mingled, a familiar aroma that reminded her of her years working long shifts at smaller airports before making it here. Instead of heading toward the executive offices, Lorraine adjusted the strap of her bag and walked toward the main terminal. Today wasn't about meetings or press conferences. Today she needed to see the airport, not from the boardroom, but from the eyes of its passengers. She had arranged for a first-class ticket on a domestic flight, under a different name. No security detail, no assistant trailing behind her, no formal introduction. Just another traveler moving through the system she was now in charge of. If she wanted to make real changes, she had to start by seeing what was broken firsthand. The terminal buzzed with activity, families huddled near check-in counters, business travelers briskly rolling their suitcases, airline staff moving with the sharp efficiency that only came from experience. She spotted a mother struggling to keep her toddler entertained while balancing a suitcase, a college student fumbling with a boarding pass, a couple in their 60s walking arm in arm toward security. This was the heart of the airport, not the boardrooms or the executive meetings. The real story unfolded here, in the way people were treated, and the silent hierarchies that dictated who was seen and who was dismissed. As she neared the check-in kiosks, she caught sight of an airline employee subtly steering a Black traveler toward the economy check-in line, despite their ticket clearly displaying first class. Lorraine's jaw tightened. It was subtle, but it was happening. And if it was happening here, it was happening in other parts of the airport too. She thought back to her own experiences, how early in her career she had been mistaken for an intern at an executive meeting, how passengers had ignored her advice when she was a gate agent, assuming she was just another unqualified hire. She had been underestimated her entire career, and now she was in a position to do something about it. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket, a message from one of the board members. "Looking forward to your first formal review. Let's make sure the transition remains smooth." Smooth. They meant unchanged. She exhaled slowly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Change was never smooth. It was disruptive, uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Taking a final glance at the check-in area, Lorraine turned toward the first-class lounge entrance. Today she wasn't here as the CEO. She was here as a passenger, and she was about to see, firsthand, whether this airport truly upheld the standards it claimed to. Lorraine Carter walked through the terminal with the kind of steady composure that came from years of being watched, judged, and underestimated. She moved like she belonged, because she did, but she also knew that to some, she never would. Ahead, the entrance to the first-class lounge stood behind sleek glass doors, a world designed for the privileged few. Plush seating, gourmet dining, a quiet escape from the chaos of the terminal. This was where business elites sealed deals over champagne, where high-status travelers relaxed before boarding their next international flight. It was a place of exclusivity, not just in ticket price, but in silent, unwritten rules. Lorraine had seen it before. She approached the reception desk, holding her first-class ticket in hand. Before she could present it, a voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am. This lounge is for first-class passengers only." The words came from a tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform, Captain Troy Dawson. The gold bars on his epaulets signified his seniority. The air of confidence in his stance suggested authority, but Lorraine immediately recognized the expression on his face. It wasn't curiosity, it was assumption. She turned to face him fully, her grip on her ticket unwavering. "I know." Dawson's eyes flickered with something, annoyance, disbelief, or maybe just the reflex of someone who had spent years reinforcing the status quo. "Do you have a ticket?" he asked, his voice neutral, but just enough edge to signal that he doubted the answer. Lorraine held it up. "Right here." For a moment, Dawson just stared at her. Then, instead of stepping aside, he turned slightly, addressing the lounge receptionist. "Check it carefully. We wouldn't want any confusion about access." The receptionist, Marcus Green, looked caught between duty and discomfort. He swallowed hard, reaching for the ticket with a forced smile. His fingers trembled slightly as he scanned the barcode. Lorraine could see it in his eyes. He recognized her, but he didn't say a word. Behind them, a few first-class travelers had taken notice. Some glanced over and quickly looked away, uninterested in whatever was unfolding. Others watched with the quiet curiosity of people who had never been in this position themselves, but had seen it happen before. The room didn't go silent, but there was a shift, a moment where everything slowed, where Lorraine felt the weight of being the only one like her in that space. She had two choices. She could let this slide, pretend it was a misunderstanding, and move along. Or she could make sure that this wasn't ignored. She chose the latter. "Is there a problem, Captain?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Dawson didn't answer immediately. He looked at her again, eyes scanning her from head to toe, as if searching for the flaw that made her an exception. "Just doing my job," he finally said. "So am I," Lorraine replied. A beat passed. The scanner beeped, and Marcus cleared his throat. "Her ticket is valid. She's cleared for entry." Dawson hesitated. Lorraine could see the tension in his jaw, the momentary flicker of doubt, but instead of stepping aside with an apology, he simply nodded and folded his arms. "Enjoy your stay," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. Lorraine took her ticket back from Marcus, giving him the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Then she turned, stepping through the glass doors into the lounge, but not before looking straight at Dawson one last time. "You have no idea what you just did," she said, her voice low enough for only him to hear. Then she walked inside, leaving him standing there. Lorraine settled into one of the plush armchairs near the far corner of the first-class lounge. The lighting was soft, the air infused with the faint aroma of freshly brewed espresso and expensive cologne. A quiet hum of conversation filled the space, the kind of murmured exchanges that only happened in places where people were used to being comfortable. She crossed her legs, casually adjusting the sleeve of her sweater, but her mind wasn't at ease. From where she sat, she had a clear view of Captain Troy Dawson. He stood by the bar, laughing with two other pilots, his stance relaxed, his confidence unwavering. There wasn't a trace of discomfort in his demeanor. No second-guessing, no regret. He didn't see what had just happened as a mistake. To him, it was nothing. Routine. Lorraine's fingers curled around the armrest. That was what made it worse. Her gaze flickered to the reception desk. Marcus Green was busy helping another guest, his movements quick, almost too precise, like he was trying to keep his focus locked on his work. But Lorraine didn't miss the way he avoided looking in her direction. She exhaled slowly. The encounter with Dawson had left her simmering, but anger wasn't what troubled her the most. It was the realization that this was likely just another day at work for him. How many times had he done this before? How many people had been turned away, dismissed, or humiliated? People who didn't have the authority to push back. She leaned back in her seat, eyes scanning the room. The passengers here were the kind who moved through the world without resistance. Business executives in tailored suits, an older couple sharing a quiet drink, a young professional scrolling through emails on a sleek tablet. No one else had questioned what had happened at the entrance. Some had noticed, sure, but no one had spoken up. That was the power of spaces like this. They were designed to make the uncomfortable invisible. A shadow moved into her peripheral vision. Mrs. Carter. Lorraine turned her head just slightly. Marcus stood beside her chair, his hands clasped in front of him. His expression was polite, professional, but there was something else there too. Hesitation. She studied him for a second before speaking. "You know who I am." Marcus gave a quick, uneasy glance toward the reception desk, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I recognized you right away." "And yet," Lorraine said, tilting her head slightly, "you didn't say anything." Marcus hesitated. I wasn't sure what to do." Lorraine raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Marcus exhaled through his nose, his voice dropping just slightly. "Not everyone in this airport is like Dawson, but he's connected. He's been here for years and people listen to him, even when they shouldn't." Lorraine felt the weight of that. She had spent enough time in corporate boardrooms to know exactly what he meant. Dawson wasn't just a rogue employee acting on his own. He was protected. Marcus shifted on his feet. "I shouldn't be saying this, but..." He glanced around, lowering his voice further. "He's been reported before." Lorraine sat up a little straighter. "Reported?" Marcus gave a small nod. "Complaints have been filed against him, more than once. But nothing ever sticks. They always get buried before they go anywhere." Lorraine's pulse ticked up. This wasn't just about her. If there had been complaints before, that meant others had faced the same thing. "Who's burying them?" she asked. Marcus hesitated again, his gaze flicking toward the bar where Dawson still stood, laughing, completely unaware of the conversation happening across the room. "I don't know for sure," Marcus admitted, "but I know he has friends in the right places, and people are afraid to push back." Lorraine nodded slowly, absorbing every word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus straightened, his professional mask slipping back into place. "I just thought you should know." Lorraine glanced toward Dawson again. This time, when she looked back at Marcus, her expression was unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply. Marcus nodded, turned, and walked back toward the reception desk. Lorraine sat still, her mind already moving to the next step. This wasn't just about Dawson anymore. This was about an entire system that allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. And now she had a reason to dig deeper. Lorraine stepped out of the first-class lounge, her heels clicking against the polished airport floor. The artificial glow of the overhead lights cast long reflections beneath her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. What Marcus had told her wasn't surprising, but it had confirmed what she had suspected. The problem wasn't just Dawson. It was deeper than one man's prejudice. She didn't need to linger in the lounge any longer. She had seen enough. As she walked through the terminal, she observed everything with sharper intent. The interactions between staff and passengers, the subtle gestures that revealed unspoken biases. A woman of color waiting at the assistance counter for far too long while other passengers were helped first. A baggage handler shaking his head as a black family approached the priority lane, only to brighten when a white businessman stepped forward. She had spent years navigating these spaces, learning to pick up on the details others overlooked. Today, she wasn't just noticing them, she was taking notes. She reached an elevator near the administrative wing and pressed the button for the top floor. The executive offices were tucked away, far from the bustle of travelers. Lorraine had spent her first few days in this role reviewing operational reports and attending introduction meetings. But none of those discussions had mentioned the systemic discrimination happening under their noses. That was about to change. The door slid open, and she strode down the hallway. The glass panels of the offices reflected her determined expression. She wasn't just another visitor anymore. She was in charge. Inside the conference room, a handful of senior staff members were already waiting. Daniel Roberts, the airport's longtime deputy director, stood near the head of the table. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, his gray suit crisp, his demeanor unreadable. He had been in this role for years, overseeing much of the airport's operations before Lorraine arrived. As she entered, the room fell silent. She took her seat at the head of the table, folding her hands in front of her. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Daniel leaned back slightly, raising an eyebrow. "That's quite the opening statement." Lorraine met his gaze evenly. "I observed something today that concerns me. Several things, actually. There have been multiple instances of discriminatory behavior at this airport, and I want a full internal review of our service practices and complaint handling procedures." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the operations managers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you referring to specific incidents?" "Yes," she said, "but I suspect what I saw is only the tip of the iceberg." Daniel sighed, setting his hands on the table. "Lorraine, I understand your concerns, but we're one of the busiest airports in the world. Incidents happen. That doesn't mean there's a pattern." Lorraine tilted her head slightly. "Then a review should confirm that, shouldn't it?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. Around the table, some of the other executives exchanged glances. Lorraine continued, her voice steady. "I want every discrimination complaint from the last 5 years reopened and reviewed. I want to know how they were handled, and I want recommendations for ensuring our passengers receive fair and equal treatment moving forward." Silence. Daniel exhaled slowly. "That's a significant undertaking, and one that might stir up unnecessary trouble." "Trouble for whom?" she asked. Before he could answer, the door swung open. Troy Dawson stepped inside. The conversation stalled as he approached, his movements slow, deliberate. His uniform was immaculate, his pilot's stripes gleaming. He didn't look at anyone else. His focus was locked on Lorraine. She leaned back in her chair. "Captain Dawson." "Mrs. Carter," he greeted, his voice smooth. "I heard you were making waves today." Lorraine didn't flinch. "You might say that." Dawson smirked. "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work. This airport has been running just fine long before you got here. A few misunderstandings don't mean the whole system is broken." Lorraine studied him for a moment. His confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was the certainty of a man who believed he couldn't be touched. She kept her voice calm. "If the system is working fine, then you have nothing to worry about, do you?" Dawson's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. "You're ambitious. I'll give you that." "Ambition has nothing to do with it," Lorraine replied. "It's about doing what's right." Dawson's smirk faded. "I've been here for over 20 years. I know this place better than anyone. You might want to tread carefully, Mrs. Carter. There are things in motion that you don't understand." Lorraine didn't break eye contact. "Then enlighten me." Dawson exhaled, running a hand over his jaw before glancing toward Daniel. "I assume you're advising against this witch hunt?" Lorraine noticed the subtle tension in Daniel's shoulders. He was caught in the middle, and he knew it. "This isn't a witch hunt," she corrected. "This is accountability." Dawson studied her for another long second, then let out a low chuckle. "Well then, good luck with that." He turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence thick enough to cut. Lorraine let the quiet settle for a moment before looking back at Daniel. "That review is happening, starting today." Daniel hesitated, but in the end he gave a slow nod. "Understood." Lorraine didn't relax. Something told her Dawson wasn't the kind of man to let this go, and she had just painted a target on her back. Lorraine sat behind her desk, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. The dim light of her office cast long shadows across the walls, the air thick with the quiet hum of the airport outside. She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there, sifting through reports, internal documents, and records of past complaints. But time felt irrelevant. The email that had landed in her inbox earlier that evening still lingered in her mind. "Be careful who you challenge. Some things are bigger than one person." There was no sender's name, no direct threat, but the message was clear. Someone didn't want her looking into this. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingertips together in thought. The weight of what she was uncovering settled heavier with each passing moment. This wasn't just about Dawson anymore. If he had been reported before, if complaints had been filed and ignored, then someone else had made sure those reports never went anywhere. She was up against more than just a single man. She was up against a system that had been designed to protect men like him. The sharp knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She exhaled, straightened her shoulders, and called out, "Come in." Daniel Roberts stepped inside. His presence was familiar now. The confident stride, the suit that always looked a little too pressed, the unreadable expression that never quite gave away what he was thinking. He was a man who had learned how to play the long game, and right now Lorraine wasn't sure whose side he was playing for. He closed the door behind him, taking a moment before speaking. "Lorraine, we need to talk." She gestured toward the chair across from her desk, but he remained standing. She took note of that. "I've been hearing he continued. "This, review you've ordered, digging into past complaints, it's making people nervous." Lorraine tilted her head slightly. "People?" Daniel exhaled. "Look, I get what you're trying to do, and I respect it. But this airport, this system, doesn't change overnight. You're trying to fix something that's been in place for decades. You can't expect to come in here and undo all of that in a matter of days." Lorraine let a small pause settle between them before responding. "I'm not trying to undo anything, Daniel. I'm trying to make sure we're not ignoring the things we shouldn't be ignoring." His jaw tightened slightly. "And if that shakes things up too much, if it disrupts the way things operate, then maybe things need to be disrupted." The flicker of irritation in his expression was almost imperceptible, but Lorraine caught it. Daniel sighed, placing his hands on the back of the chair in front of him. "I just don't want you making enemies you don't need to make." Lorraine's eyes didn't waver. "I'm not worried about enemies. I'm worried about whether or not this airport is running the way it should be." A beat of silence. Then Daniel straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with slow precision. "Just be careful," he said finally. "Some of us have been here long enough to know that the higher you climb, the harder the fall." He didn't wait for her response. He simply turned and left. Lorraine sat there for a long moment, her mind turning over every word. He wasn't just warning her. He was making sure she understood the stakes. She didn't have time to dwell on it, not when there was more to uncover. And she wasn't the only one who knew that. Dawson stood in a dimly lit corner of the airport staff lounge, surrounded by a handful of men who had worked under him for years. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and engine fuel, and the conversation was laced with quiet tension. "I don't like it," one of the men muttered. "She's pushing too hard, asking too many questions." Dawson leaned back against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. "She thinks she can come in here and clean house. She doesn't understand how this place runs." Another pilot shook his head. "She's not letting this go, Troy. If she keeps digging, she's going to find things we don't want her to find." Dawson smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "She's making a mistake." A few nods around the room, unspoken agreements, shared looks of understanding. "Then maybe," Dawson said, his voice lower now, "it's time she learned how things work around here." Lorraine's phone buzzed against her desk. She reached for it, glancing at the screen. An email. This one wasn't anonymous. It was a formal complaint. A passenger had come forward with a new report, one that named Dawson directly. She opened the file, scanning the details. The accusation was clear. Dawson had intentionally delayed a black passenger's boarding, forcing them to miss their flight. The passenger had filed a complaint at the time, but it had never been processed. It had disappeared into the void of bureaucratic silence. Lorraine felt the slow burn of anger settle in her chest. This wasn't just a pattern. It was a deliberate effort to silence the people who spoke up. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Marcus," she said when he answered, "I need to see you. Now." She hung up, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the distant lights of the runway flickered as a plane took off, disappearing into the night sky. She had a choice. She could let this go, or she could fight. For her, there was never really a choice at all. Lorraine flipped through the pages of the report Marcus had placed in front of her. The office was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of airport activity beyond her closed door. The weight of the document in her hands felt heavier than it should, not because of the paper itself, but because of what it represented. Each page detailed a different case: passengers who had filed complaints against Dawson, employees who had raised concerns, and incidents that should have led to disciplinary action but had mysteriously vanished from the system. Some reports had barely made it past the initial filing stage before being stamped "resolved" with no further documentation. Others had disappeared entirely, as if they had never existed. She had expected to find a pattern. She hadn't expected to find proof that the system had been designed to protect him. "How did you get this?" she asked, her voice measured. Marcus shifted in his chair across from her, rubbing the back of his neck. "A friend in records owed me a favor. It wasn't easy. Most of this stuff isn't supposed to be accessible anymore. But it was never really deleted, just buried deep enough that no one would look for it." Lorraine exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temple. "And no one ever challenged this?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "Some tried, but every time a complaint made it too far, it got shut down. People were either reassigned, ignored, or quietly encouraged to drop it. Dawson isn't just a problem. He's a protected problem." Lorraine's grip on the report tightened as she turned another page. And then she saw it, a name that stood out among the signatures: Daniel Roberts. Her stomach clenched. It wasn't just Dawson. Daniel had personally signed off on the dismissal of multiple cases, some of them dating back over a decade. He hadn't just ignored complaints, he had actively erased them. Lorraine set the folder down, leaning back in her chair. Marcus watched her carefully. "You see it, don't you?" She nodded slowly. "This is bigger than Dawson. This is systemic." A long pause stretched between them. Marcus exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't realize how deep it went. And if Daniel was covering for Dawson, that means this isn't just about one man's prejudice," Lorraine finished. "It's about control. It's about power." Marcus frowned. "So what do we do?" Lorraine tapped her fingers against the desk, considering the weight of the question. If she exposed this, she wouldn't just be taking down Dawson. She'd be taking on the entire infrastructure that had protected him for years. And Daniel Roberts wouldn't let that happen without a fight. By the time she left the office that evening, the airport was quieter, the usual rush of passengers thinning as flights departed into the night. Lorraine walked through the terminal with a steady pace, her thoughts moving even faster than her steps. She had a decision to make. If she went public with this report, there would be backlash. Daniel had influence. Dawson had allies. And the system had a way of punishing people who tried to dismantle it. But if she stayed silent, nothing would change. She stopped near one of the large windows overlooking the tarmac. A plane was taxiing down the runway, its lights blinking against the darkening sky. That's when she heard his voice. "You really want to do this?" She turned slowly. Daniel stood a few feet away, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. He looked calm, but Lorraine knew better. He had found out about her investigation. He knew she had something. She held his gaze. "I don't want to. I have to." Daniel sighed, stepping closer. "You think this is about Dawson? He's a small piece of a much bigger picture." "That's exactly why I'm not stopping," she said evenly. His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're up against." "I understand just fine," she replied. "I understand that people like Dawson don't get away with this for years unless someone helps them. And now I know exactly who's been helping." Daniel studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You think you can take this public and just walk away unscathed? You think you can bring all of this down without consequences?" Lorraine didn't blink. "I think the real question is, can you?" Silence stretched between them. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Lorraine said, "but at least it's not the mistake of staying quiet." Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he turned and walked away. Lorraine watched him go, her resolve hardening. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and selected a name. A reporter she trusted. A voice on the other end answered. I have something you'll want to see, she said. She had made her choice. Lorraine sat at her desk, eyes locked on the news ticker running across the bottom of her screen. The words scrolled past in stark white letters against a blue backdrop. Allegations of discrimination at Hartsfield-Jackson spark internal review. It had begun. The report she had leaked to the journalist had made its way into the public eye, and now there was no turning back. A well-respected investigative reporter had picked up the story, detailing how multiple complaints against Captain Troy Dawson had been buried over the years. It wasn't just a hit piece, it was evidence, and it was forcing people to pay attention. She scrolled through an article, reading their reactions. Some passengers were coming forward with their own experiences, stories that had never been reported before. Former employees had started reaching out anonymously, confirming what she already knew. This wasn't a single incident. This was a pattern, one that had been protected by the very people meant to uphold fairness. Her phone buzzed. Another anonymous email. You need to stop this before it's too late. You're making enemies you can't afford to have. Lorraine exhaled sharply, setting the phone down. The warnings weren't new, but the weight of them felt heavier now. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't just trying to intimidate her. They wanted her to know she was walking into a storm. And they were right. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up as Daniel Roberts stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was unreadable, his movements precise, calculated. He didn't sit. He just stood there watching her. You've certainly made things interesting, he said finally. Lorraine leaned back, folding her arms. That's one way to put it. Daniel sighed, stepping closer. You realize what you've done, don't you? This could have been handled internally. Instead, you've turned it into a spectacle. Lorraine tilted her head slightly. A spectacle or accountability? His jaw tightened. Don't act like you don't know the difference. You could have kept this contained. But now, you've put the entire airport under a microscope. Good, she said, voice steady. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Daniel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? Dawson is expendable. If you had focused on him, maybe we could have worked something out. But you didn't stop there. You're tearing into the foundation of this place, and people are going to push back. Lorraine's gaze didn't waver. If the foundation is built on injustice, then it deserves to crumble. A flicker of something passed over his face. Annoyance, maybe even a trace of something deeper. But he recovered quickly. I can help you, he said, lowering his voice. I can make this easier for you. But only if you stop before this gets out of control. Lorraine studied him. He wasn't making an offer. He was giving her an out, a chance to walk away before things got uglier. But she had already made her decision. If I stop now, she said, nothing changes. Daniel's expression hardened. Then you're making a mistake. Maybe, Lorraine replied, but it's mine to make. A long silence stretched between them. Then without another word, Daniel turned and walked out. She didn't need him to say anything else. She knew exactly what would happen next. Dawson stood at the front of the briefing room, looking out over a group of pilots and senior staff. The atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken frustration. He could feel the weight of the stares, the expectation for him to take control of the situation. This is bigger than just me, he said, his voice calm but firm. Lorraine Carter isn't just looking for justice. She's looking for blood. She's making this personal, and if we don't stand up now, she's going to dismantle everything we've built here. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. A veteran pilot crossed his arms. So what are we supposed to do? Sit back and let her ruin the careers of good men? Dawson smirked slightly. Of course not. He let the words settle before continuing. We push back. We remind people that this airport doesn't run on political agendas. It runs on experience, on tradition. One of the senior staff members leaned forward. You think we can stop this? Dawson's smile was cold. We don't need to stop it. We just need to make sure people start questioning her motives. It wouldn't take much. A few conversations in the right places, a few suggestions that Lorraine wasn't really here to fix things. She was here to control them, that she was using this investigation as a way to reshape the airport into her own image. People didn't need facts to believe something. They just needed doubt. And Dawson was more than willing to give them that. Lorraine's phone buzzed on her desk. She reached for it. expecting another warning. But it wasn't an anonymous message. It was the reporter she had contacted. She answered, "Tell me you have something." The journalist's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "I do, and you're going to want to hear this." Lorraine gripped the phone tighter. "What did you find?" There was a brief pause, then, "A recording. It's from an internal source. It's Dawson, caught on tape making explicitly racist remarks about passengers. And it's not just him, he names others who support him." Lorraine's breath caught for half a second. This was it. This wasn't just an allegation anymore. It was proof. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. With this, she could bring him down completely. But she also knew that if she went public with it now, she wouldn't just be exposing Dawson. She'd be exposing everyone connected to him. And that meant the entire system would come for her. She exhaled. "I want to hear the tape." Lorraine stepped into the dimly lit break room, the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. It was late, and most of the airport staff had either gone home or were deep into their night shifts. Across the room, Marcus Green sat at a small round table, his fingers drumming lightly against the plastic surface. When he saw her, he straightened, eyes darting toward the door behind her, as if to make sure she hadn't been followed. "You said you had something for me," Lorraine said, keeping her voice low. Marcus nodded and reached into his backpack, pulling out a small flash drive. He slid it across the table toward her. "This is from security footage," he said. "It's a few years old, but it's still in the system. No one ever deleted it. They just buried it where no one would find it." Lorraine picked up the drive, weighing it in her palm. "What's on it?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "It's Dawson." A gate agent had flagged an issue with a passenger's boarding pass. Something minor, nothing that should have caused a delay. But Dawson got involved. He made sure the guy missed his flight. Lorraine's fingers tightened around the drive. "And the passenger?" "Black man, business traveler, had a first-class ticket, checked in on time. But Dawson stalled him at the gate with a random security check that wasn't random at all. The guy protested, tried to ask for a supervisor. By the time they let him through, the doors had already closed." Lorraine exhaled slowly. She had known Dawson was guilty, but this was undeniable. If she released this footage, there would be no room for interpretation. The public wouldn't see it as a misunderstanding or a simple oversight. They would see it for what it was: blatant discrimination. She looked up at Marcus. "Why are you giving this to me?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Because I'm sick of watching this place protect the wrong people, and because I know you're the only one who might actually do something about it." Lorraine tucked the flash drive into her pocket. "You realize that if I use this, it's not just Dawson I'll be coming after." "I know," Marcus said, "and that's exactly why you should use it." The next morning, Lorraine stood at the head of the long mahogany table in the executive conference room. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Around her, members of the airport's senior leadership sat in stiff, upright postures, their faces unreadable. At the far end of the table, Dawson sat with his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He was completely at ease, as if this entire meeting was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Daniel Roberts, seated beside him, cleared his throat. "Lorraine, you called this meeting. Why don't you tell us what's so urgent?" Lorraine scanned the faces around the table. She could feel the weight of every decision she had made leading up to this moment. If she showed the footage now, Dawson would be done. But she also knew what would happen next. The system wouldn't collapse overnight. It would fight back. People like Daniel would shift the narrative, claiming Dawson had been unfairly targeted. They would use his downfall as a way to turn others against her, to make her seem like the real threat. She had the power to end Dawson's career in an instant, but she wanted more than that. She wanted to dismantle the entire system that had allowed him to thrive, so she made a choice. "We're implementing an independent review of all passenger interactions at this airport," she announced, effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. "That's a drastic measure." Lorraine met his gaze. "We need to know if our policies are being followed, or if certain individuals are taking liberties with their authority. Dawson let out a short laugh, shaking his head. And who exactly is going to be conducting this review? Lorraine smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Not us, a third-party oversight committee, completely independent. They'll have full access to all records, security footage, and passenger complaints from the past 5 years. The room fell silent. Dawson's smirk faltered just slightly. Daniel's jaw tightened. They knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't just about investigating Dawson. This was about exposing everyone who had protected him. Daniel exhaled through his nose. Lorraine, this kind of review will create unnecessary panic. It could disrupt operations, erode public trust. Public trust isn't built on silence, she interrupted. It's built on accountability. If this airport is running the way it should, then this review won't find anything wrong. But if there are deeper issues, then we need to address them. She let the words sink in. Dawson shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table. You're playing a dangerous game, Marn, he said, voice low. Lorraine held his gaze. So are you. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He realized he might not be in control of this anymore. Lorraine gathered her papers, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned back, looking directly at Dawson. You think you've won? She said quietly. Not yet. Then she stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind a room full of people who weren't sure which way the power was shifting. Lorraine sat at her desk, fingers resting lightly against the surface of a thick folder. The office felt quieter than usual, the distant hum of the airport beyond her door barely registering in her mind. Spread out before her were the final details of the independent service audit, a report that would determine whether the culture of discrimination at Hartsfield-Jackson could be proven. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Her computer screen dimmed as she hesitated, staring at an unread email in her inbox. No subject line, no sender information, just a single message. Dawson isn't the only one who will fall if you keep this up. Walk away before you destroy everything. Lorraine inhaled sharply. It wasn't the first warning she had received, but this one felt different, more urgent, more personal. She leaned back, her mind turning over the possibilities. Someone within the upper ranks of the airport was watching her. They knew what she was doing, and they were trying to stop her before it was too late. But too late for who? She closed the message, stood up, and walked toward the window, looking down at the busy tarmac below. Flights arriving and departing, people coming and going, unaware of the power struggles unfolding behind the scenes. She had come too far to back down now. By noon, the independent review team had arrived. A small group of compliance officers, dressed in sharp suits and carrying tablets, moved methodically through the terminal, observing interactions between staff and passengers. Their goal was to assess the quality of service, particularly in high-status areas like first-class lounges. Dawson walked through the corridors of the airport as if nothing was wrong. His stride was confident, his expression unreadable. He greeted fellow pilots with nods, made small talk with airline staff, and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable. He wasn't worried about the review. He had been here for decades. He had seen investigations come and go, always ending with nothing. Marcus stood at a distance watching. He knew better. Dawson had been reckless before, but now? Now he was under a microscope, and all it would take was one misstep. Lorraine, watching from her office, felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. This was her shot, but there was no guarantee the system wouldn't still protect Dawson. And if it did, where would that leave her? It started as a minor incident. A woman, mid-40s, dressed in a tailored suit, approached the entrance to the first-class lounge. She handed over her boarding pass, expecting the usual routine. The attendant at the desk glanced at it, then hesitated. "Just a moment, ma'am," he said, looking toward Dawson, who had positioned himself near the reception area. The woman shifted slightly, her brow furrowing. "Is there a problem?" Dawson stepped forward. "It seems there's a mix-up with your access," he said smoothly. The woman frowned. "Mix-up? I have a first-class ticket." "I understand," Dawson replied, his tone polite but firm. "But our policies require additional verification in some cases." The woman stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "In some cases?" Dawson didn't respond right away. but someone else did. One of the compliance officers had been standing nearby, listening. He glanced at the boarding pass, then at the woman, then finally at Dawson. "What kind of verification is required?" the officer asked. Dawson's jaw tightened slightly. "It's standard procedure for certain passengers." The room was silent for a beat, and then a voice from the crowd. "Certain passengers?" A man nearby had his phone raised, recording the entire interaction. The growing murmur in the lounge signaled that more people were paying attention now. Lorraine watched it unfold from her office as Marcus's urgent text flashed across her screen. "He did it. On camera." The video spread like wildfire. A black woman in business attire, calmly but firmly questioning why she was being denied entry to a lounge she had every right to be in. Dawson standing there, offering vague justifications. The compliance officer looking visibly uncomfortable. And the kicker, the moment the woman stated clearly, "I fly out of this airport every week, and this has never happened before." The video was online before the audit had even concluded, and Lorraine knew without a doubt that this was the turning point. She had been preparing for a long fight. She had gathered evidence, lined up witnesses, built a case. But Dawson had done the job for her. He had given the world proof of exactly who he was, and this time, the system wouldn't be able to bury it. The morning air inside Hartsfield-Jackson was thick with tension. Lorraine sat in her office, eyes fixed on her laptop screen as the video played once again. It had only been released for a few hours, but the damage had already been done. The footage of Dawson barring a black woman from the first-class lounge without reason had gone viral. News outlets were running segments on it, passengers were speaking out about their own experiences, and social media was ablaze with outrage. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The board had no choice now. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "Emergency board meeting at 10 a.m. Dawson and Roberts will be there. This is it." She closed her laptop and stood up, straightening her blazer. It was time. The conference room was filled with uneasy chatter when Lorraine stepped in. Members of the airport's executive board sat in their usual spots, but today there was no sense of routine. Some looked pale, others angry. At the far end of the table, Daniel Roberts sat with his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. Dawson stood near the window, talking in hushed tones with a few senior pilots. He was tense, but still carried himself with the arrogance of a man who thought he could survive this. Lorraine took her seat, meeting the glances of those around her. Then the chairman cleared his throat. "I believe we all know why we're here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "The situation regarding Captain Dawson has escalated beyond what any of us anticipated. Given the severity of the allegations and the public response, we must determine the appropriate course of action." Lorraine didn't miss the way Dawson straightened at that, like a man ready to defend himself. He leaned forward, voice calm but forceful. "With all due respect, we need to take a step back and assess the bigger picture. This so-called scandal is being blown out of proportion. One video taken out of context should not dictate my career." A few heads nodded. Dawson still had supporters. He continued, looking around the table. "I have dedicated over 20 years to this airport. I've trained pilots, ensured safety, and upheld our standards. Are we really going to let one overzealous administrator dismantle everything we've built?" Lorraine's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. Daniel spoke next. "We need to be strategic. If we handle this poorly, we risk destabilizing the entire operation of this airport. We don't want to make rash decisions." It was subtle, but Lorraine caught it. He wasn't defending Dawson outright. He was buying time. She wasn't going to let him. Lorraine placed her hands on the table. "This isn't about one video. It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for years." Dawson scoffed. "And where's your proof?" She didn't hesitate. "Right here." She nodded toward the door, and a moment later, it opened. A man stepped inside, middle-aged, dressed in a crisp suit, but there was tension in his shoulders. Lorraine recognized him from an old employee file. His name was James Holloway, a former gate agent, fired 5 years ago under Dawson's authority. James stepped forward, looking directly at Dawson. "You remember me, don't you?" His voice was steady. Dawson's face remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. James turned to the board. 5 years ago, I filed a complaint against Captain Dawson. I saw him deliberately stall black passengers at the gate, questioning their credentials when he didn't question others. I reported it. A week later, I was put on probation. A month later, I was fired for performance issues that had never been mentioned before. The room was silent. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file. And I'm not the only one. These are records from former employees, people who tried to speak up and were silenced. You can try to ignore one complaint, but this, he dropped the file onto the table. This is a pattern. Lorraine saw the shift immediately. Some board members looked at one another, uneasy. Others leaned forward, flipping through the pages. Dawson clenched his jaw. This is ridiculous. But now even Daniel looked uncertain. Lorraine didn't wait. The public is watching. They've seen the video, and now they're hearing the truth. If this board chooses to protect Dawson after this, they'll have to explain why. The chairman exchanged a glance with the legal advisor, then spoke. Captain Dawson, you are hereby suspended pending a full investigation. A murmur ran through the room. Dawson stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't be serious. The chairman didn't waver. This is no longer in our hands. The FAA is already reviewing the case, and the media scrutiny will not disappear. You will cooperate fully, or further action will be taken. Dawson looked rattled. Lorraine watched as he took in the faces around him. The support he had relied on was no longer there. He grabbed his briefcase, his movements stiff. You're making a mistake, he muttered before storming out of the room. Lorraine let out a slow breath. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment before the chairman turned to her. This isn't over, he said. There are larger implications here. Lorraine met his gaze. I know. She did. Dawson was just one man. But the system that had protected him, that was still standing. And Lorraine wasn't done yet. The air inside the boardroom was thick with tension. Lorraine sat at the long conference table, her fingers pressed together in a firm clasp, as she listened to the murmur of voices around her. Dawson was gone, for now, but the battle wasn't over. The board hadn't made a final decision. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, despite the public backlash, there were still those who hesitated. They were afraid of what firing Dawson might mean, afraid of the message it would send. And Daniel Roberts, he was doing everything in his power to stall. At the head of the table, the chairman cleared his throat. We've received significant pressure from various sources, he began, his voice measured. The FAA has launched its own review, and our legal team has warned us that terminating Captain Dawson could result in a lengthy legal battle. Lorraine had heard enough. She pushed back her chair and stood. A legal battle is the least of our concerns right now. All eyes turned to her. Daniel leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Lorraine, no one is saying Dawson's actions were acceptable, but we have to think strategically. If we fire him outright, we set a precedent. And if pilots and senior staff start feeling like their jobs aren't secure, she cut him off. Their jobs should never have been secure at the expense of fairness. We're not talking about someone who made a single mistake. We're talking about a man who has a history of targeting passengers and employees. If we don't act now, we're not just protecting Dawson. We're protecting everything he represents. Silence. Some of the board members shifted in their seats, uneasy. Daniel's expression darkened. And you think dismantling years of procedure overnight is the answer? Lorraine met his gaze. I think letting this continue is the bigger mistake. She knew she had support in the room. Some of the newer board members had already begun nodding in agreement. But others, those who had been here as long as Daniel, were hesitant. And that hesitation was exactly what Daniel was counting on. Let's not forget, he said smoothly, that Dawson isn't the only one being scrutinized here. If we start digging too deep, who knows what else might come to light? A quiet warning, a thinly veiled threat. Lorraine held her ground. If you're worried about what an investigation might uncover, then maybe you should be asking yourself why. Daniel's jaw tightened. Watch yourself, Carter. She tilted her head. Why? Afraid of what I'll find? A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. The chairman exhaled. Enough. This is getting us nowhere. We need time to review all legal options before making any decisions. Lorraine saw exactly what was happening. They were stalling, hoping the public outrage would fade, that the problem would disappear if they waited long enough. She wasn't going to let that happen. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel lingered, waiting until the others had filed out before turning to her. "You really think you've won, don't you?" he said quietly. Lorraine didn't smile. "I think the truth is finally catching up to you." Daniel smirked, but there was something else in his eyes, something colder. "You have no idea what you've started." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "And you have no idea what's coming." Then she walked out, leaving him standing there. By the time she reached her office, her phone was vibrating nonstop. Messages, news alerts. Something was happening. She unlocked the screen and froze. A breaking news headline flashed across the top of the page. Internal emails reveal systematic cover-ups at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Attached was a leaked document, emails exchanged between Dawson, Daniel, and other executives over the years. They detailed a coordinated effort to suppress complaints, manipulate internal investigations, and protect senior staff members accused of misconduct. Lorraine's heart pounded. Someone inside had leaked this. Someone who had seen enough and decided to act. And now the board didn't have the luxury of waiting. She could already picture Daniel's face when he saw the report. He was losing control. Lorraine sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She had forced their hand. But the fight wasn't over yet. The media frenzy surrounding Hartsfield-Jackson had only intensified. Every major news outlet was running segments on the scandal, dissecting leaked emails, digging into past complaints, and putting a spotlight on the failures of the airport's leadership. Lorraine scrolled through the latest headlines from her office. Discrimination scandal at Hartsfield-Jackson. Who knew what and when? Captain Dawson suspended, but will he be held accountable? FAA launches inquiry into alleged cover-ups at major U.S. airport. It was happening. The pressure was no longer just on Dawson. It had spread, consuming Daniel Roberts and the entire leadership structure that had protected him for years. And now it wasn't just the public demanding action. The pilots' union was facing its own reckoning. Their leadership had remained silent at first, hoping the scandal would blow over. But now they were being forced to make a choice: defend Dawson and risk their credibility, or cut him loose to salvage their reputation. The boardroom was silent as Lorraine entered. Several members of the executive committee sat in tense postures, eyes darting between each other. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. The chairman spoke first. "Lorraine, you requested this meeting. What exactly are you proposing?" She placed a folder on the table. "We need to stop treating this like an isolated incident. It's not just about Dawson. It's not just about Daniel. This entire system needs to be rebuilt." A few murmurs rose in the room. Daniel, seated at the far end of the table, let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "So now you're calling for a total overhaul? Do you even understand the consequences of what you're suggesting?" Lorraine didn't flinch. "I understand that if we don't act now, we'll lose control of this entirely. The FAA is already involved. If we wait for them to dictate the terms, we won't have a say in what happens next." Daniel's smirk faltered. She continued, "I'm calling for a full reform of the employee evaluation and complaint resolution system. No more internal handling of discrimination reports. We bring in independent oversight. We establish a transparent review process for staff complaints. And we make it clear, no one is untouchable anymore." Silence. Then, one of the senior members spoke. "That would require a complete policy rewrite." "Yes," Lorraine said simply. Another voice. "It would mean restructuring entire departments." "Yes," Daniel leaned forward. "And it would mean upending decades of tradition." Lorraine met his gaze. "Yes, it would. And that's exactly why we need to do it." Daniel knew he was losing. After the meeting, he found Lorraine in the hallway, waiting for the elevator. His steps were slow, deliberate, but she could hear the frustration in his voice before he even spoke. "You're not going to stop, are you?" Lorraine pressed the elevator button. "No." He exhaled through his nose. "I'm offering you a way out of this mess. I'll resign quietly. No public statements, no legal battles, But you make sure I walk away with my reputation intact." She turned to face him. "Your reputation was built on covering for men like Dawson. And you want me to protect that?" His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to give you an easy win." Lorraine didn't blink. "I don't want an easy win. I want a real one." The elevator doors opened, and she stepped inside without another word. Daniel didn't follow. She saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Defeat. Dawson wasn't going down quietly. That evening, he sat across from a news anchor in a primetime interview, his expression carefully composed. He spoke calmly, methodically, casting himself as the victim of a power-hungry administrator who was trying to destroy the careers of hardworking employees. "This isn't about justice," he said smoothly. "It's about control. I've dedicated my life to this airport, and now I'm being painted as the villain just because I expect high standards. This is a political witch hunt." But no matter how carefully he chose his words, the damage was already done. The evidence against him was too overwhelming. The leaked emails, the testimonies, the video footage. There was no twisting the truth anymore. By the next morning, the board had called for a final vote. Lorraine sat at the table, hands folded in front of her, as the decision was announced. Effective immediately, Captain Troy Dawson is terminated from Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Furthermore, the board has agreed to a full independent audit of past employee complaints, with recommendations for systemic reform. A second pause. And as for Daniel Roberts, he will also be stepping down, pending an investigation into his role in suppressing reports of misconduct. The decision was final. Lorraine felt the weight of it settle over her. She had won. But as she sat there watching Dawson storm out of the room, watching Daniel slump slightly in his chair, she knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of something bigger. Because systems like this didn't collapse overnight. They had to be dismantled, piece by piece, and she was just getting started. Lorraine sat in her office, staring at the email from the board. Dawson was officially terminated. Daniel had been placed on indefinite suspension, pending further investigation. She should have felt victorious. But as she scrolled through news headlines, she knew this wasn't over. The backlash had begun. Hartsfield-Jackson's internal policies were under scrutiny, and the airport's leadership was being forced to answer for years of complacency. A growing number of senior employees were speaking out, some in support of reform, others furious that their way of doing things was being dismantled. Lorraine had expected resistance, but what she hadn't expected was the level of hostility now aimed directly at her. A memo had circulated among some of the longest-serving employees, accusing her of disrupting the stability of the airport. The pilots' union was now involved, debating whether to stage a walkout in protest of Dawson's removal. And worst of all, Dawson wasn't done fighting. The announcement caught her off guard. Her assistant rushed into her office, face pale. "You need to see this." Lorraine followed her down the hall to a side conference room where a few executives had gathered around the television. The airport's usual dull hum faded as the voice of a news anchor filled the space. Breaking news out of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, where former Captain Troy Dawson is holding a press conference. The screen cut to Dawson standing at a podium, his expression grave. "I stand before you today, not just as a pilot, but as a man whose career has been unjustly destroyed by personal vendettas and political maneuvering," he said, his voice calm, measured. Lorraine's stomach tightened. She should have seen this coming. "For over 2 decades, I have served this airport with integrity," Dawson continued. "Yet I was targeted in a campaign led by one person, Lorraine Carter, who sought to advance her own agenda at the expense of stability and fairness." The camera panned to a few individuals standing behind him. Former colleagues, a few pilots, even some airport employees. These so-called reforms she's pushing? They are not about justice. They are about control. She has taken it upon herself to dismantle a system that has worked for years, punishing dedicated employees and creating an environment of fear. This is not leadership. This is a reckless power grab. The murmurs in the room around Lorraine grew louder. Dawson wasn't just defending himself. He was turning this into an attack on her leadership. He leaned forward, gripping the podium. "If Lorraine Carter truly wanted change, she would have worked with those of us who know how this airport runs. Instead, she has chosen to purge anyone who doesn't align with her vision, disregarding years of service and experience. Lorraine clenched her jaw. He was good. He wasn't just painting himself as a victim. He was making it seem like she was the real threat. The camera cut to a reporter raising a hand. Captain Dawson, are you saying you were unfairly targeted? Dawson nodded solemnly. I was not given due process. I was accused, judged, and sentenced without a fair review. And I am not the only one. There are others, employees who are now afraid that they'll be next simply for standing their ground. Another reporter spoke up. What do you say to those who claim the evidence against you was undeniable? Dawson exhaled. I say that in a world where perception matters more than facts, it's easy to paint someone as guilty when you want them gone. But ask yourselves, if this was truly about justice, why stop at me? Why is she the sole authority deciding who stays and who goes? Lorraine's phone buzzed on the table. A text from Marcus. This is bad. He's playing the long game. She already knew that. And if she didn't respond, if she let this narrative take hold, Dawson could shift public sentiment in his favor. She couldn't let that happen. Lorraine stood in the press room of the airport headquarters, the bright lights nearly blinding as she stepped up to the podium. Journalists murmured as they scrambled to get their microphones in place. The room was packed. Cameras pointed at her from every angle. She took a breath. This morning, Captain Troy Dawson made a series of statements regarding his removal from Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. I want to be clear about something. This is not about politics. This is about accountability. She let that word settle before continuing. The decision to terminate Captain Dawson was not made lightly. It was the result of a thorough review of multiple complaints filed over a span of years. These complaints were not fabricated. They were real. They were ignored. And the system that allowed that to happen is what we are working to change. A reporter near the front raised his hand. Captain Dawson claims you are using your position to conduct a purge of employees you don't agree with. How do you respond to that? Lorraine met his gaze. I respond by saying that no one, no matter how long they've worked here, is above the standards we set for treating passengers and employees with respect. This is not a purge. This is the process of making sure this airport operates with fairness and integrity. If some find that threatening, then maybe they should ask themselves why. Another voice chimed in. Some employees claim you're causing instability, that your changes are disrupting operations. Lorraine didn't flinch. Change is uncomfortable. But what's more dangerous? Discomfort, or allowing a culture of bias and neglect to continue? If we want to be a world-class airport, then we need to hold ourselves to a world-class standard. That's what I'm here to do. The questions continued, but Lorraine knew she had set the tone. This wasn't about Dawson anymore. This was about something bigger, and she wasn't backing down. The bright lights of the television studio cast a sharp glow on Lorraine's face as she sat across from the anchor of one of the most-watched news programs in the country. The cameras were rolling, and the entire nation was tuned in, waiting for her response. The host adjusted his papers, looking at her with measured curiosity. Ms. Carter, former Captain Troy Dawson has made some serious allegations against you, stating that your actions were politically motivated and that your reforms are creating instability at Hartsfield-Jackson. How do you respond to that? Lorraine sat upright, her voice steady. This was never about one man. It was never about Troy Dawson. It's about a system that allowed discrimination to go unchecked for years. A system that protected some while silencing others. If people like him feel threatened by these changes, then that tells me we're doing something right. The host leaned in. So you're saying this is part of a larger issue? She nodded. Absolutely. What happened with Captain Dawson was just a symptom of a deeper problem. That's why we're not stopping here. We're launching a full independent review of all airport policies, from how complaints are handled to how employees are promoted, to ensure that fairness isn't just an idea, but a reality. The host paused, absorbing her words. So you're saying the system is broken? Lorraine met his gaze. I'm saying the system was designed to benefit a select few at the expense of everyone else. And that stops now. The studio was silent for a moment before the host moved on. But Lorraine knew she had said exactly what needed to be said. Back at the airport, Dawson's last supporters were crumbling. A former colleague of his, another longtime pilot, stepped forward with even more damning information. In a written statement to the press, he detailed how Dawson had used his influence to promote certain employees while deliberately blocking others from advancing. He had manipulated schedules, interfered with hiring decisions, and created a culture of favoritism that punished anyone who dared to challenge him. The final blow came when the pilots' union officially withdrew their support. For weeks they had debated their stance, but in the end, the mounting evidence was undeniable. If they stood by Dawson, they would risk losing credibility and public trust. The statement from the union was brief but devastating. The actions of Captain Dawson do not reflect the values of this organization. We support transparency, fairness, and accountability in all aspects of aviation. We will cooperate fully with the ongoing investigations to ensure that our industry remains one of integrity. Dawson was finished. There was no more public sympathy, no more allies to shield him. He had lost everything. The next morning, Lorraine stood before a room filled with airport employees. Hundreds of faces staring at her, some filled with uncertainty, others with hope. This was the moment that mattered. She took a deep breath. We are standing at the start of something new. For too long, this airport has operated under rules that benefited a few, while holding back many. That ends today. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. We are implementing real change, she continued. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees. A new transparent complaint resolution system with independent oversight. Clearer pathways for advancement based on merit, not favoritism. These aren't just promises. They are policies that will be enforced. She saw some faces tense, but she also saw heads nodding, people whispering to one another. I know change is uncomfortable, she said, but ask yourselves this. Why should fairness and accountability feel like a threat? Why should holding people to a higher standard be seen as an attack? Silence then, a voice from the back. I've worked here for 15 years, an older ground crew supervisor said, and I've seen good people pushed aside while others get ahead for the wrong reasons. If this means that finally changes, then I support it. Another voice followed. Me too. Then another, and another. Lorraine felt something shift. Not everyone in the room would be on her side. Some people would resist. Some would even try to undermine these reforms. She wasn't fighting alone. She had started something real. And it wasn't stopping now. That afternoon, Dawson walked out of Hartsfield-Jackson for the last time. There were no reporters waiting for him, no farewell party, no colleagues to shake his hand. He moved through the terminal like a man who had once commanded attention, but was now invisible. No one stopped him. No one said goodbye. He disappeared into the crowd, just another traveler with nowhere to go. Lorraine stood by the window of her office, watching the planes take off. She knew this wasn't the end of the battle. The system didn't change overnight, and there would be more fights ahead. But today she had won. The future of the airport wasn't built on silence. It was built on truth. Lorraine Carter sat at her desk, looking out over the tarmac as another plane lifted into the sky. The airport felt calm. The chaos had subsided. The boardroom battles were over. The scandal had faded from the headlines. And yet Lorraine knew this wasn't the end. She turned her attention back to the reports in front of her. The airport's new policies were already being implemented. Independent oversight on employee complaints, transparent hiring practices, mandatory anti-discrimination training. The changes were real, and they were happening. But the real question was, would they last? She exhaled, rubbing her temples. She had won the fight against Dawson. She had exposed Daniel Roberts for his complicity. But even with those victories, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper still lurked beneath the surface. Because systems didn't change just because one man was removed. They changed when the people inside them decided to change. And that, she knew, would take more than policy updates and press conferences. Across town, Daniel Roberts sat in a nearly empty office, packing the last of his belongings into a worn leather briefcase. The official statement from the board had been vague. He had stepped down to pursue other opportunities. But everyone knew the truth. He hadn't left by choice. The internal investigation had made it impossible for him to stay. Emails, memos, records of meetings where he had buried complaints instead of addressing them, it had all come to light. The moment the board realized keeping him would only bring more scrutiny, they turned their backs on him. He had built his career on knowing how to navigate power. But in the end, he had miscalculated. He had underestimated Lorraine Carter. As he walked out of the office for the last time, there was no farewell party, no colleagues stopping him to say goodbye. Just silence. And for a man like Daniel, that silence was the worst punishment of all. Dawson, however, refused to go quietly. His face flashed across the screen of a conservative news network where he sat opposite a host who was more than happy to frame him as a victim of cancel culture. "The truth is," Dawson said, leaning forward with a practiced expression of frustration, "I was targeted. Not for my actions, but because I represented something these people wanted to destroy. I stood for tradition, for order. And in today's world, that makes you a villain." The host nodded sympathetically. "Do you think this was personal?" Dawson scoffed. Of course it was personal. Lorraine Carter didn't just want change. She wanted control. She wanted power. And the easiest way to get it was by tearing down people like me. Lorraine watched the interview from her office, shaking her head. It was predictable. He was trying to rewrite history, trying to paint himself as the real victim. But this time, no one was listening. The next day, the pilots' union issued a formal statement. Captain Troy Dawson's removal was based on verified complaints and a clear pattern of misconduct. We stand with the leadership of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in their efforts to ensure a fair and just workplace. Not a single airline would touch him. His name was tainted. His career was over. And unlike before, when he had allies to protect him, this time he stood alone. That evening, Lorraine was preparing to leave when her assistant knocked on the door, holding a plain envelope. "This came for you," she said, setting it on the desk. Lorraine opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the typed words inside. It was a list, names, dates, a record of employees who had been forced out over the years, people who had filed complaints, who had spoken up, who had refused to play along with Dawson and Daniel's system. Some had been fired for vague performance issues. Others had been pushed out through reassignment, demotions, or sudden changes to their schedules that made their jobs impossible to keep. They had been erased from the system, but someone hadn't forgotten them. Lorraine placed the letter down slowly. This wasn't over. It never had been. She had thought taking down Dawson and Daniel would be enough, but now she saw the bigger picture. There were still people who deserved justice, people who had been forced out of jobs they had earned simply because they had refused to stay silent. She wasn't finished. Not yet. As she locked her office for the night, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle she had fought wasn't just about removing bad actors. It was about making sure no one else suffered the same fate, and she wasn't going to stop until that battle was won. A year had passed since the Dawson scandal shook Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The headlines had faded, but the changes remained. Walking through the terminal, Lorraine saw the differences everywhere. The once opaque complaint process had been replaced with a transparent system that ensured every report was reviewed fairly. New hiring policies had opened doors for people who had once been overlooked. Employees, especially those who had been silenced before, spoke up with more confidence, knowing they would be heard. It wasn't perfect. Change never was. But it was real. She watched as a group of newly hired ground crew members received training from a supervisor. Not the old dismissive training that had once been standard, but a real structured course that included anti-discrimination workshops and accountability measures. For years, people like Dawson and Daniel Roberts had controlled the culture of this place, believing that tradition meant protection for the few. But that culture had been dismantled, piece by piece, and Lorraine Carter had been the one to tear it down. Back in her office, Lorraine looked at the framed newspaper article on the wall. Hartsfield-Jackson Reforms, a year of change under Lorraine Carter's leadership. She had kept it there not as a reminder of victory, but as a reminder of the work still left to do. She had won battles. She had removed men like Dawson, She had rewritten policies, but systems were stubborn. The moment people stopped paying attention, they had a way of slipping back into old habits. Her phone buzzed. A message from an old colleague. Thought you'd want to see this. You were right. Some people never change. Attached was a link to a new report, a list of high-ranking airport officials, different names, different titles, but the same patterns of behavior, the same corruption. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. She had thought maybe, just maybe, that after everything, the worst was behind her. But she should have known better. The fight wasn't over. It never was. A knock on the door. Marcus Green stepped in, his expression tense. He had been one of her earliest allies, and over the past year, he had proven himself time and time again. He set a thick folder on her desk. You need to see this, he said. Lorraine opened it, scanning the contents. Financial discrepancies, undisclosed partnerships, a web of deals between airport executives and private contractors that reeked of fraud. Bigger than Dawson, bigger than Daniel. She closed the file, looking up at Marcus. How bad is it? He hesitated. Worse than before. If this gets out, it won't just be about one or two people. It'll shake the entire leadership structure. Lorraine set the file down and took a deep breath. The weight of it all pressed down on her. She had fought so hard to fix the system, and yet here it was again. Another battle waiting to be fought. She had a choice. She could walk away. She had done enough. No one would blame her. Or she could do what she had always done. She could fight. Lorraine reached for the file again, flipping through the pages. She already knew her answer. She wasn't done yet. And that's the real fight, isn't it? Change isn't about taking down one bad actor. It's about dismantling the systems that let them thrive in the first place. Lorraine Carter didn't just win a battle. She sparked a movement. But as we've seen, corruption never truly disappears. It just finds new faces, new ways to survive. So what do you think? Can one person really change an entire system, or will history always find a way to repeat itself? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories of power, justice, and the fight for something bigger than ourselves, make sure to subscribe. Because trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.